Welcome to Social Impact Careers 101. My name is Jen Lashansky. I'm the Chief Engagement Officer and Chief Career Coach at Be Social Change. And I'm really happy to be leading this session for all of you. This is one of those topics that I think a lot of people glance over. We've all just sort of decided that we know what social impact means without ever really studying it in depth. And so therefore, social impact careers has become this amorphous yet really powerful field of work. And we're going to just sort of dissect it today, jump into a couple of good learnings, and give plenty of time for any questions that you may have. So feel free to share those in the chat. I will get to them at the end. A little bit more about myself before we dive in. As I said, I'm the Chief Engagement Officer as well as the Chief Career Coach of Be Social Change. My work experience is vast, and it includes being a career coach and a social impact guide. I have worked for nonprofits, social enterprises. I've volunteered a lot with governmental agencies, and I have a bit of a specialty also in CSR from the work that Be Social Change has done. So combining all of that work experience, I'm going to share with you some of the insights and high-level topics about social impact careers. Not only what they are, but how you can get one if you're looking to make a shift toward more meaningful work. Quickly, Be Social Change is an organization that's dedicated to helping you make your greatest impact. If you are not familiar with Be Social Change's events, welcome to your first webinar. If you've been to 1 or 100 webinars, welcome back. We're so happy to have you. We have a whole host of a whole library, if you will, of different events and webinar topics in order to help you in your careers, whether it's gaining a social impact career, growing in one, or changing careers. So check it out. We also do live networking every month. Our next event I'll share a little bit more about, but we have a really active calendar, so check out that as well. So a little bit about what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about what are social impact jobs. We're going to really get nitty-gritty on what it means. We're going to talk about the key skills and terms that social impact professionals need to know. We're going to talk about where to look for those roles and how to make connections into the social impact space. So basically how you can network effectively and meaningfully with social impact professionals. So diving right in, social impact, what does it mean? Very broadly, it's any activity that creates a social or environmental good. Now, a lot of organizations will separate out social and environmental impact, and we tend to see them as a unit. Social factors and environmental factors are deeply interwoven in a way where whenever you're creating a positive environmental change, it's going to have a social impact. Whenever you're creating a social impact, ideally it's grounded in environmental wellness. And so social impact encapsulates all of that. And social impact jobs, because it's anything that creates a social impact, social or environmental impact, it's pretty broad. So what are the sectors where people generally think of social impact work? We have nonprofits, social enterprises, and B Corps. I'm going to dive into that, do fear not. Corporate social responsibility, and then the government and public sector. I'm going to go through each one of these in a little bit more detail so that you can understand how each sector is contributing to the social and environmental good that is so profoundly needed at this moment. So nonprofits are also called NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or 501c3s. And the 501c3 simply because that's their tax status in the United States tax code. Means that they don't pay taxes because they're not revenue generating organizations. Their purpose is to dispel their profits into local community or international endeavors. So I want to talk a little bit about nonprofits because they have quite a rap. Nonprofits are capable of creating amazing change. And yet a lot of nonprofits are not rooted in holistic systemic change. So oftentimes you'll hear people saying that the nonprofit sector is highly problematic or challenged. And in a lot of ways, they're right. That's not to say that great nonprofits don't exist. They certainly do. It's just a matter of finding those and ensuring that they're working at a thoroughly systemic level to affect change. And I'll describe what that means in greater detail. I also want to talk that nonprofits, like any sector, can come with organizations of all sizes. So there's a lot of large-scale nonprofits that you've probably heard of, like the American Red Cross or Human Rights Watch. There's many organizations out there that we kind of hear and know of as household names. There's pros and cons to working with a large non-scale profit, large-scale nonprofit. And some of those pros is that you have a large reach and impact. What a large-scale nonprofit can do is going to outweigh what a smaller organization with lesser resources can do. So it feels great to be contributing to a mission that has large-scale reach. The con is that they tend to be bureaucratic. It's a large-scale organization tempting social good. And so a lot of large nonprofits face issues of slow bureaucracy in their work. Now, on the flip side, you have the small-scale nonprofits. The pro is that you get really in-depth services. Smaller organizations tend to be more community-based. They tend to be more localized. And so their services can go a bit deeper. One of the cons that you'll often hear about working for a small-scale nonprofit is that you're going to be asked to take on a lot of roles. You have to wear many hats in a nonprofit that's small, including like fundraising, communications, operations, programming. You might be doing a little bit of everything. If that's your jam, awesome. But it's something to be aware of, especially if you're conscious of creating a work-life balance. Social enterprises, I'm going to talk a little bit about, and B Corps. If you have never heard of these terms, fear not. Social enterprise is simply an organization that is dedicated to serving a social mission. Now, some of the best definitions out there come from the Social Enterprise Alliance, or SEA. They've just worked to formalize a cohesive definition, which is really exciting for what makes a social enterprise. And the other kind of category of purpose-driven businesses that we'll often talk about is B Corps. Now, B Corps are specifically organizations that have passed a certification saying that their standards for running their business toward a social model are of a high value. Now, in that image that you see, that little B in a circle, that's the B Corp label. You might see it on some of your favorite brands, such as Tom's of Maine or Patagonia or Ben & Jerry's, my personal favorite. So these are organizations that have literally dedicated themselves to a set of standards and are using those in order to drive forward better business. Now, the difference between a social enterprise or a B Corp and a nonprofit is that social enterprises and B Corps definitely going to be probably better resourced. There's a business mandate behind them. And so while nonprofits are oftentimes going out and looking for resources, social enterprises and B Corps are actually generating those resources themselves. So for that reason, there's a lot of opportunity to keep growing these organizations. Now, however, these are businesses. So they're not nonprofits. They're not purely social entities. They are really dedicated towards making a profit while also serving people. One thing that this often looks like is that organizations will oftentimes be consultancies. There's a lot of agencies out there that serve nonprofits or serve bigger businesses or are ad agencies for social good. So a lot of social enterprises and B Corps are actually dedicated to the kind of serving the industry as a whole. Something to be aware of. As people think about social impact careers, they often overlook that there's lots of agencies and lots of different organizations out there that are actually serving a broad swath of socially driven organizations. And I mentioned the phrase people over profit. This is something that's pretty characteristic of social enterprises and B Corps, is that people are wanting to create a true kind of sense of well-being for humans, not just dedicate themselves to some sort of profit. So that's a little bit about social enterprises and B Corps. If you haven't really seen this B Corp label, I recommend starting to look out for it in some of your favorite, brands to shop. It's usually a sign that they have pretty high standards for what it is that they're doing environmentally, governance-wise, and so forth. Corporate social responsibility is also known as CSR. It's becoming very widespread. What does this mean? A lot of people will call this corporate citizenship, corporate do-gooding, whatever it might be. It's something that more and more organizations, and especially large-scale corporations, are feeling the mandate to take forward. Now, CSR roles are sometimes viewed as the most desirable jobs, which makes them highly competitive. The reason is that they come with the stability of working for a large corporation or a bigger business. And they also have the perks of that. So whereas for smaller organizations or nonprofits, you might be taking a salary hit, corporate social responsibility offices are funded by the corporations in which they're housed, and therefore they have generally a higher salary rate, higher rate of compensation, sometimes greater resources for the work, and sometimes not. It really varies because the size of a CSR department varies enormously. It could be one person, or it could be 150. Each organization, based on what the corporation does and how much of a mandate it feels towards CSR, is going to have a different sense of what this is. Now, one thing I want to talk about is that a lot of corporations are also house their CSR departments under things like marketing. They might house CSR departments under social impact. They might house CSR departments under programming. There's so many different ways in which a CSR department can sit, but it's something to be aware of as you look for social impact work. If you're looking for a level of authenticity, you might not get that if a CSR department is housed under a corporation's marketing department. Now, one thing that we all have to be aware of, especially in this day and age, is really that there's a lot of green and pink and DEI washing, and I'll get into what those terms mean. But the idea is that a lot of corporations claim social good without actually backing it up. A good standard for social good is undoing the harm that any sort of business activity might be generating, and very few corporations actually meet that standard. So again, it's just something to be aware of. I'm flying through this, but I want to say too that there's lots of other types of social impact roles. I mentioned government. There's also freelancers. The government and the public sector is a pretty broad swath. It's everything from education to healthcare to public service. That's huge. And there's a lot of good resources out there. If you're interested in those, I will share them with you. But these are the ones that we tend to focus on because they're the most direct and least diluted sectors of social impact. If you're working for a social enterprise, a B Corp, CSR department, or a nonprofit, it generally means that there's absolutely that the intention of the role is to generate a social impact. Whereas if you're doing public service, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, maybe it's holding down a different role. Now, one of the things that's really important whenever you're looking for a job and whenever you're switching sectors or whenever you're introducing yourself to a new sector is to learn the key terminology of that space. It's sort of like you're going to learn a different language when you are trying to switch sectors or when you're trying to enter a new sector. You have to learn what terms they care about, what they mean, how you can communicate with them yourself in an interview or in a networking conversation. So one of the main terms that I've even said already in this session is mission-driven. A social mission is at the heart of all those different sectors that I mentioned. And being mission-driven specifically is important. I'll get into the definitions for each of these terms in a moment, actually. These are just some of the broad ones that almost feel like you really should know these if you're seeking to enter anything in the social impact space. There's, of course, a lot more topics. For example, nonprofits use terms like, fundraising and beneficiaries, whereas a business probably uses, revenue generating and stakeholders instead. So learning the terminology is going to be important, but here are some of the key ones that I want to make sure that everybody is aware of. Mission-driven means benefiting a social or environmental cause at its core. So a mission-driven organization is dedicated to this at its core. It's not a negotiable thing. They have to be fulfilling this. That's true of those social enterprises, of B Corps, of nonprofits for sure, and hopefully of a lot of CSR initiatives that we're seeing. DEI or JEDI, hopefully you know what these terms mean already, but they're absolutely core and fundamental to social impact work. DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and JEDI means specifically justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. JEDI tends to be, you can tell the level of seriousness of an organization's DEI initiatives if they've incorporated terms like justice. When it comes to social impact, a lot of work, including nonprofit work especially, has been done in sort of this way that has reproduced some colonialistic structures and hierarchies. Think about how often you see campaigns for international development that feature kind of the poor global South. There's really a move away from doing that because we're understanding that in doing so, we're setting a certain racial idea or norm in marketing materials or in fundraising or in messages, et cetera. So looking at JEDI and DEI work through the social impact space is so crucial to understanding how effective an organization is being at that systemic change that I mentioned at the beginning. This needs to be incorporated in every organization. The SDGs stand for, you might have heard this, sometimes it's a hot topic, especially in September in New York City. You get kind of the whole world comes to the United Nations to talk about the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. This was a UN-generated term that arose from the Millennium Development Goals, which were created in 2000, and were a set of unifying ideas for organizations, countries, and governments to work toward. Now, these were refreshed in 2015 to now be a set of 17 goals with subtopics, definitely, but 17 primary goals. And a lot of organizations will form their CSR initiatives around the SDGs. The countries are responsible for trying to fulfill the SDGs, which can be everything from girls' education to ocean safety and protection. So it's a vast range of topics, and I highly recommend checking these out. They'll also help you if you're ever going into an interview, talk about your favorite SDG. It's a great way of kind of like showing some social proof that you know what you're talking about. Now, there's the term sustainability, everybody hears and everybody needs to keep hearing. However, one thing that a lot of organizations are looking at is that sustainability isn't really viable anymore. We are not in a place where sustainability is the goal. We can't sustain what we've done. We actually have to look at regenerative activities, which means that we're putting in to the earth and the ecosystems more than we're extracting. Some of the key ways of sort of directing sustainability initiatives for organizations are the circular economy, having a closed loop economy of packaging and products. So you can imagine that your Ben & Jerry's is going to come in an aluminum container, and then you're going to ship that aluminum container back to wherever you ordered it from, and they're going to send it back to you. So no new waste is generated in the packaging of items. That's basically circular economy 101. It does have levels of complexity that are pretty cool. And then zero waste, low to no plastic production. It's pretty simple. Know these terms and study the other terms of whichever sector you're most interested in going into as far as social impact careers. Now, one thing that everybody has questions about is where can I look for a social impact job? And there are many places. I'm going to give a shout out to the Be Social Change Jobs Board. It's a great place to look for a job for sure. We got new jobs a lot at a time. There's other great organizations out there like Cause Artist and Social Impact Listings. All of these places are starting to gather social impact jobs. Now, a couple of sector-specific ones. Idealist.org is sort of the go-to jobs boards for nonprofits. Be the Change is the same for B Corps, Net Impact for CSR, and there are so many more. In fact, I'm going to include a great link that has a whole bunch of other resources in the follow-up email that you'll receive as a result of joining this webinar. One thing that I want to caution everybody against, this is one of my #1 rules with anybody I do coaching work with, is don't doom scrolling through jobs boards. There's no need to go through a jobs board and see how many openings are up there and what it is that you think you can do and what it is that, the jobs that you see you can and cannot do. It has an impact on us just the way that social media doom scrolling does. It's also not particularly effective. Only 20% of jobs are given as a result of, sending in an application to someplace. 80% of jobs are attached to having a contact, a connection, or someone in your network within one of those spaces. And so as tempting as it is to go onto each of these jobs boards and set up, the notifications, it's even better to network. One quick thing I want to add here, places like LinkedIn and Indeed also have a pretty amazing library of social impact jobs. Just tailor the terms to be sector specific, meaning look for nonprofit jobs, look for social enterprise jobs, et cetera. So I want to talk about networking for a moment. Networking within social impact is one of the most important things that you can do. The reason is that social impact implies that there's going to be community involvement, collaboration, and that it's going to be a movement-oriented project. That's true of almost, I would say 99.9% of social impact initiatives. So knowing how to make relationships is crucial and vital within the social impact space. And that applies even before you get into a role for how it is that you go ahead and you set your direction. So when I say set your direction, I mean make those relationships. One thing that I want everybody to do before they network is to get really clear on your own direction. Do your homework. Choose the sector that you want to work in. Choose the type of role. Choose the organization size. Choose the location. These are a couple of the criteria that you need to have in mind as you network, so that you're not reaching out to people with like, hey, I think we should connect, and they have no idea why you want to connect with them. If you can say, hey, I'm looking for a role in a small scale nonprofit in New York City that's dedicated to this mission, or where I can bring my communication skills, fantastic. That gives somebody a sense of what it is that they're going to be able to talk to you about. So having direction is not only important for yourself and for your own journey, but it's also a gift you give to the people that you are networking with. It's important to identify who you want to network with. I once saw this great meme of somebody out on the street going, hey, you want to network? You want to network? You want to network? And sort of asking every passerby if they wanted to network. Not a great strategy. You really want to get specific on who are the people who either have access to connections that you need, or who have the information and knowledge and lived experience that you're seeking to learn more about. So identify who you want to network with is going to help you in a big way. One way that you can do this, obviously, is LinkedIn. LinkedIn is going to be a really good tool in any job search. Go online and see who's working in CSR in your favorite organization and connect with them. See if you can have a conversation. There's a lot of tips for like LinkedIn cold outreach. Check those out. And even better, if you have somebody who who can connect you to a person within those organizations. Now, speaking of people who can connect you, we tend to call this your champion level supporters. These are people you've probably worked with in the past, friends and family members who are willing to go to bat for you a little bit. They'll make introductions, they'll send in recommendations, whatever it takes to support you in your journey. One of the crucial steps that we all overlook is asking our champion level supporters for connections. Think about how many people probably belong to some sort of nonprofit organization as a volunteer or a board member. They might be working in a corporation and know a lot about a CSR initiative. A lot of people you're immediately connected to will have contacts for you. So reach out to them and let them know that you're seeking to make a change, or that you're seeking to learn more about the sector, and ask if they have anybody they can introduce you to. This is one of the easiest ways to network that almost everybody forgets to do. So you could be ahead of the game by just simply sending that email with your direction and clarity in it to your champion level supporters. Practice your pitch. One thing I find is that a lot of people will kind of feel like they're fumbling through it to get close to a general sense of like, hey, this is what I'm interested in. This is what I want to do. And that's not great, because fumbling through it, it doesn't inspire a whole lot of confidence for me to say, hey, I want to take the time to introduce you to somebody who's in a position, a leadership position within my favorite nonprofit. You want to prove that you've done your homework, that you are dedicated to this pathway. So practice your pitch that really demonstrates that. One thing about any pitch is that it needs to be brief, succinct, and it needs to be memorable. So I will receive a lot of networking requests, and sometimes I receive 5-paragraph emails So people saying, hey, can you connect me to this person? This is what I'm interested in. 5 paragraphs later, they get to the end. When I receive those emails, I literally I send them back to the person and say, hey, I need you to synopsize this for me in 2 sentences. Because you're asking the person who you're asking for a favor to do a whole lot of additional work to try to synthesize what it is that you want versus you doing that synthesization yourself. So practice your pitch, and most importantly, make it mission driven. What do I mean by this? One of the greatest mistakes that anybody makes in a job search, but especially people who have not worked in the social impact space before is that they make the pursuit of a job about themselves. So people will write a cover letter saying, I'm really excited about this position. It's exactly what I've been looking for. I'm so excited. I hope you'll choose me. And that's fine, but it's not as effective as saying, hey, I really want to contribute to this mission. I am motivated to get out of bed every day and address this issue. When you make it mission driven, you prove a level of seriousness about what the organization is doing socially that is really important, and it's not to be overlooked. Organizations and hiring managers will really appreciate that because they know that you're not just sending in 100 applications, that you've actually chosen to send in an application for the organization that they're hiring for, that you know what it is that their social mission is, and that you're a socially conscious person. So even if your background experience isn't in the social impact space, this is one of the ways that you can communicate your seriousness about a social impact role and your readiness to switch sectors. I hope that's clear, and I'm happy to clarify anything. Okay, I'm going to take a deep breath, and I want to invite each of you, if you're here presently live, feel free to throw any questions that you might have in the chat. I'm happy to answer anything I can. This has been a pretty broad overview, and I'm happy to go into a little bit more detail. But my hope is that you feel equipped with what you need in order to start thinking about in a social impact career. I do want to offer a few additional resources, some of which will be included in a follow-up email. And one of them is to become a Be Social Change member for $79 a year, which is a pretty low price, if I may say so myself. Part of the reason is that we have a free access to webinar recordings, to over 50 webinar recordings on everything from the future of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, to the future of education, to the nonprofit sector, to CSR. There's a whole lot of topics out there. So if you're seeking to learn more, you're seeking to learn that vocabulary, these are going to be a great way to do so. You'll also have access to our free online events, as well as free in-person events in New York City. And you'll have free member-only networking with social impact professionals who have been in the business for a long time. We also do free online workshops, just like this one, and webinars. And if I may say again, we have the best purpose-driven community out there. Over 1,000 people working towards social impact in their everyday work and lives. So I want to take time now to answer any questions that you might have. Please feel free to include them in the chat. I'm going to stop share so I can see the chat. And feel free to send any other questions as I'm answering them. Okay, 2 questions. What are good examples of CSR companies? And what is the average salary in a social impact job versus social enterprises versus CSR? Okay, great questions. So good examples of CSR companies vary. A CSR initiative really varies and changes even as time goes on. It's a little bit tricky because some organizations do a better job of marketing their CSR initiatives than necessarily creating the change specifically. I tend to think that larger scale B Corps have the best CSR initiatives. So for example, Patagonia is more dedicated to environmental grant making in the communities where it has stores than any other organization I know. Whereas something like Adidas has a really cool program where all of its rubber is now made of recycled ocean plastic in a partnership that they have with a nonprofit called Parlay. So with Patagonia, it's a much more embedded CSR initiative. With something like Adidas, it's kind of like it's a great initiative. It's pretty widespread, but it's also not impacting, for example, their internal governance, the experience of their workers, social conditions, et cetera. So a lot of CSR initiatives also come from organizations that you might be surprised to learn from. and learn of, such as like law firms have a great record for CSR in some situations. Not all law firms by any means, but a lot of law firms spend a lot of money doing social good in the communities where they're based. A lot of banks are now spending more and more time with this, and they're doing something called impact investing, which includes the term ESG. You might have heard of that before, environmental, social, and governance standards. And then most like new products, a lot of new products are coming out with the sense of like, hey, we have to do something different than what we've been doing. So for example, newer organizations tend to have good CSR initiatives. Even places like Walmart are investing in the circular economy. So there are quite a few examples. It's hard to give just one or two, but those are some of the ones that come to mind for me immediately. So what is the average salary in social impact job versus social enterprises versus CSR? I'm going to read the social impact job. I'm going to say nonprofit versus social enterprise versus CSR. So nonprofit salaries tend to be on the lower side because resources are scarce and because most of the funds tend to be channeled directly toward programming. That is a broad generalization. So you'll find nonprofits that are thoroughly dedicated to social good. Don't even worry about it. To like socially setting up their staff with good salaries. Large scale nonprofits tend to have larger salaries. And most cities release something called a nonprofit salary report each year, which gives an overview of the average salary based on the size of the organization and based on each role. New York has really great ones. It's easy to go through and check those out. Nonprofits tend to have the lowest salary of these three categories, but again, I'm speaking in generalizations. Social enterprises you can think of social enterprises as encompassing a lot of startups. So you might see some startup level salaries, you might see some higher than startup level salaries, and you might see some lower than startup level salaries. It's going to vary. A lot of social enterprises are giving away part of their revenue as a way of fulfilling their social mission. You might have heard of the 1% for the Planet Pledge. So already a social enterprise is working with less revenue than many organizations, and therefore their salaries might be slightly impacted. That said, this category is the hardest to pin down with like here's an average salary. CSR initiatives tend to have pretty high salary ranges, and that's because they're housed in corporations or law firms or banks. So when it comes to CSR salaries, you're probably looking at a pretty high one, but again, it's hard to say exactly. One thing that you can do is that Indeed, which is a jobs board, released something called the salary calculator. And so whenever you're looking at a position, you can input details of that position into this salary calculator, and it will tell you on average what to expect as far as a salary and what's a competitive level salary. So check out that resource, and I'll include it in the follow-up email. Lucy asked, do you find that most CR positions are hired in-house first before they are advertised externally? Lucy, you hit it right on the head. Yes. Unfortunately, one of the reasons that one of the consequences of CSR having such high salaries is that people really are drawn to them, and they're highly competitive. And they're highly competitive for people inside an organization, right? If you've been working in an organization for a long time and you want to do a social good, you might try and just make that shift internally and move over to the CSR department. A lot of organizations will do this. And that's not just true for CSR. Most organizations try to hire internally before hiring externally. So when people kind of get rejected from jobs and they're feeling upset, I always try to remind people, it's almost never because of you. It's almost always because someone was hired internally, the job role changed, et cetera. So I hope that feels a little bit comforting. But yes, CSR roles are advertised internally before being advertised externally, or a lot of the time at the same time, but they give much higher precedence or value to internal applications. There's some great CSR jobs boards out there that I'm going to include in the follow-up email. So take a look at, keep your eyes open for that. But again, be really cautious of CSR positions if authentic social impact is at the very core of what you want to do. Test the CSR departments that you're applying to before you go in by really doing your research to say, is this greenwashing? Is this pinkwashing to say, that we're all about female empowerment and yet our CSR initiative is led by 5 dudes? And then DEI washing. Are we saying that we're all about, promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in our workforce? And again, it's led by entirely white people. So really question your CSR organizations, their initiatives, see how thorough they are before applying in the first place. I hope that this session is a helpful step in your own journey towards creating social impact through your work. And I appreciate each one of your time and attention on this topic. Thanks, everybody.